Good evening to everyone participating on Zoom and watching via YouTube live stream, and welcome to the first event in our series, Resilience in Times of Crisis. My name is Max Veldhake, and I am the rabbi and project leader for the Jewish Future Forum. This also happens to be the inaugural event of the Jewish Future Forum. The Jewish Future Forum is a new initiative of the Leo Baeck Foundation and is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. It combines two scholarship programs which seek to strengthen Jewish life not only in the Federal Republic of Germany, but across Europe and the world. The Benno Jakob Peter Pappenheim Scholarship is awarded to non-EU nationals studying for the rabbinate and cantorate in Germany, and the newly established Global Jewish Leadership Program funds non-EU Jewish students wishing to study at a German university. Both of these programs are part of the Jewish Future Forum, strengthen the already vibrant and engaging Jewish life in Germany, and seek to support Jewish life in communities abroad by offering future Jewish change agents the opportunity to network with their Jewish peers and Jewish institutions. We are extremely pleased to be able to organize this event series. The topic of resilience has, over the course of the pandemic, become imminently and self-evidentially necessarily in public discourse. People the world over are becoming confronted not only with the pandemic crisis, but a litany of others. These crises contribute to feelings of despair and heightened stress. How should each of us individually and as a group deal with these changes? How can we remain resilient in the face of such trying times? The Jewish people and the Jewish tradition are no strangers to adversary. It is in no small part due to Jewish resiliency that the Jewish people have been able to overcome centuries of challenges and hardships. It is therefore fitting that we ask experts from across the Jewish spectrum about this topic. They can offer us their insights into resiliency from a multitude of perspectives from the Jewish tradition. We have not only this inaugural event that we have on the 15th of July with Professor Hasia Diener, and also on the 12th of August with Rabbi Delphine Ovier, a continuation of this series about which we are very pleased. So I am happy, extremely happy to introduce Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, the executive director of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at New York University, the university chaplain for NYU, and an adjunct professor for public administration in the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Rabbi Sarna is a 2003 graduate of the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, and in 2002, he came to NYU. Since coming to NYU, he has founded the Jewish Learning Fellowship, which offers intensive courses of study for students without yeshiva backgrounds, has worked to strengthen interfaith relationships on the NYU campus, and has worked to bridge the different sects of Judaism with NYU. And also, and I learned this when I met Rabbi Sarna in New York on a trip there, in 2019, he was appointed the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of the United Arab Emirates. So without further ado, thank you very, very much for being with us this evening, this afternoon. Rabbi Sarna, it's your platform.
So it's so wonderful to be here. And Max, thank you for the very kind introduction. And I delight in hearing about every new major step that's taken in the development of German Jewry. And the Jewish Futures Forum is incredibly exciting, and it makes sense, that people from all over would want to come to Germany to understand to be trained as rabbis, to understand how the community is experiencing a rebirth. In fact, for me, as I've been working over the past number of years very diligently on how to establish the first new Jewish community in an Arab country in over a century. In many ways, what's been occurring in Germany is a model in the sense that there's so much that you have done, particularly in focusing on recruiting talent, academic excellence, and bold courage in just getting up and doing. That has been an inspiration to me. So I'm so indebted. And I would say for me, the bedrock of that channel of learning certainly flows through my friendship with Joe Frank, and for which I'm always so grateful for his vision and being the kind of person who we can at once talk about how to change the world, and also just share a beer together. So my thanks to Joe Frank as well. Let me say a few words about the title of this talk, which is Resilience in Interfaith Settings and in the light of the pandemic. And I wanted to distinguish between two terms, which, resilience on the one hand, and I probably should have included this other term as well, which has become popular recently, which is anti-fragility. Initially a term in biology, but resilience is best defined as being able to endure or persevere even during adversity. So someone knocks you down and you get up again. And anti-fragility, again borrowed from the biological sciences, is not just that whatever it is, when faced with adversity, it is the adversity itself that makes a person stronger. So it's not just about enduring or surviving through, but it's also, more importantly, it's about how facing that adversity actually makes a person or an organism stronger. It builds up a kind of immunity. It's anti-fragility, makes a person less fragile than they were beforehand. So if it's every time you get knocked down, you are actually, not only do you get up again, but you're actually stronger when you do get up again. And I wanted to introduce these terms: resiliency, which is just the ability to get back up again, and anti-fragility. It is when adversity actually makes you stronger, redoubles your resolve. In the context of dealing with the pandemic and all the social phenomena which the pandemic has either accelerated or introduced, and which have been very much a part of the experience. And the case that I wanted to make is that we need both. Not every kind of challenge is going to be the kind of challenge or the kind of adversity, frankly, that it builds our anti-fragility. And sometimes we need to just expect that our confrontation with adversity needs to be managed with hunkering down and letting the storm pass. But other times we need to be able to leap at the opportunity to recognize that a counter movement, a troubling social phenomenon, is something which can actually lead us to become better and stronger within an interfaith context. I'm going to be returning to these two terms, but I wanted to introduce them at the outset. The other introduction of terms that I wanted to do, I'm going to borrow from the eminent sociologist of religion, American sociologist of religion, named Robert Wuthnow, who, when looking not at any one particular religion, but at the broad stretch of American religion as a whole, categorized religious groups into three categories, or I would say even religious attitudes into three categories. One he called exclusivist, when a group sees itself as being the sole bearer of the truth, and that if there's any other group that holds a truth the same that they do, it's out of mere coincidence, but that we have the truth and no one else does. They happen to, it's just by accident. And what now notices is that this belief also comes with many social phenomena and behavior. Typically, he'll say younger age of marriage, living closer to people who are like-minded, and that is part of the same religious group, less mobility, less higher education. And then he says there's another category, which is he defines as inclusivist, which is the belief that our group has the truth. However, it's possible that other groups also have partial truths. That is, they're partially right, and that he terms as inclusivist. Then there's a third category, which he calls pluralistic, or which he also, I guess, in a tongue-in-cheek way refers to as spiritual shopping, which believes that there's no one group that holds the truth, but in fact, the truth can be found in many different places, and that a person is best served by taking the best of each. Perhaps in the channeling the Maimonidean statement, Kabel emet mimisha amaro, take truth from whoever says it, which is Maimonides' way of telling his co-religionists, it's okay if I, borrow a lot from Aristotle. Kabel emet mimisha amaro, whatever the practice happens to be, or belief happens to be, if it's out there and it feels right, seems right, then a person's spiritual path ought to be composed of knitting together those different practices or beliefs, and unsurprisingly, the social phenomena that come along with that attitude are kind of living among greater heterogeneity, different kinds of people, typically more years in higher education, and then typically, of course, later age of marriage, fewer children, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I wanted to introduce these terms: exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralistic, because their reaction, and here I speak from my experience in the United States, and as someone who lived in New York City during the height of the pandemic, when New York City was a global epicenter. The approach of people to the pandemic, religious people specifically, from what I could see, actually also subdivided by these categories, by Whatnow's categories. And there's one particular kernel which I wanted to focus on, and then I wanted to move to how that impacts some of the stormy weather that we've seen when it comes to interfaith engagement, as well as some of the more pastoral horizons that we've seen. What it appears to be is that the exclusivist approach, that is the belief that we alone hold the truth, and the social realities of living mostly among one's own, reinforces a certain kind of particularistic view of a group among humanity. That is, reinforces the idea that our group particularly is special in one way or another, and that belief is so fundamental to the exclusivist worldview that something like a pandemic presents not just a threat to people's lives, but perhaps more importantly, a threat to the idea that one group is different than another. That is, the pandemic, for some religious people, the religious people who held an exclusivist worldview, the pandemic threatened the idea so fundamental to those societies, those religious groups, religious communities, which is that my community is different, fundamentally different, and it's expressed in different religious groups in different ways. Our soul is different, our body is different, our community is different, providence over us is different. Whatever makes us different is actually under threat by something like a pandemic, which affects all human beings. And perhaps most importantly, unquestionably, from a scientific standpoint, makes it clear that human beings are interdependent. That is, the way I behave will absolutely affect whether or not other people will become infected with the virus, no matter whether they are Jewish or Christian or Muslim or secular. No matter what you are, it's about humanity. And of all the material symbols of the shared human vulnerability in the face of the pandemic, there was no one greater than the mask. The mask is a garb, and it took on in a way, a symbolic life of its own, different than the life that it had previously as something that doctors wear or nurses wore or dentists wore. All of a sudden, the mask became emblematic of shared humanity, the shared vulnerability of humanity. Again, a threat to the exclusivist worldview, which doubled down on the kind of the uniqueness of a particular in-group. And what we saw, and this is my observation, and again, this is my observation in New York, in the United States, and others may have other views on it, is that the threat to the particularist worldview was considered a greater threat than the physical threat of the virus, because that threat to the particular worldview came close to undermining the very foundations of exclusivist societies. And because of that, the mask became a target. The potential that the mask would become more visible outwardly than any other religious, symbol on a person's body, which reinforces difference, which reinforces particularism. The fact that there would be on everybody one shared symbol, that we are all human, ultimately, was a very grave threat. And I have to tell you, even though I thought once it became clear, a little bit clearer what the pandemic was, I believed that what we would see was a softening of particularist ideologies, a humbling of those ideals, which so often lead to conflict or lead to war or lead to division. I thought that we would see a softening of that approach. I thought we would see some out-migration from exclusivist communities to others, given the kind of incontrovertible and horrific logic that the pandemic presented us with. But I don't think that we actually saw that. Instead, what I observed by and large, and this is generalization, by and large, what we saw was a strengthening of theologies which accounted for suffering. Those existed within exclusivist communities. And we saw an elaboration of figuring out why it is that we are suffering in this way, but not actually questioning foundations of the relationship between self and other, that is, between one particularist identity and another. And this appeared to people who were in the other camps, the inclusivist or the pluralistic. This approach seemed almost unintelligible, illegible. Why would a community shun masks? And this was my experience on December, when the numbers of the pandemic were rising. My children and I, we went Hanukkah shopping in a Hasidic neighborhood in the New York area, and not a single person was wearing a mask, not a single person. Even though it said on the front of the stores, entry only with masks, there was no one in the store wearing a mask. It was like being in a time machine. And it seemed so incomprehensible. But I think that it was that very incomprehensibility actually increased the sense of, we are doing this our own way. We are particular people who are doing this our own way, and we are through that becoming not vulnerable to the attack and the fundamentals of our community, which is that we are different. Let me pivot for a second, and then I'll invite perhaps in conversation with my friend Joe Frank and maybe some other comments. Let me get specific a little about some of the interfaith activity that I did see and some of the challenges to interfaith which came about, and whether or not they brought about resilience, or in some cases anti-fragility. And as we move on from the pandemic, hopefully as we move on from the pandemic, what kind of interfaith activity do I think, or do I hope we'll be stronger in? So there are, I think in the same way that those who would have been resistant to any meaningful dialogue across religious groups, just like their approaches were hardened, I believe at the same time, those who for whom religion was more about shared humanity than it was about differences between people, the fierce experience of chosenness as against over and against any other experience. For those for whom religion is primarily rooted in shared humanity, of course, the pandemic provided them with the best case in point, and I believe will serve as a watershed moment for the decade or possibly decades to come. I think this pandemic will is better categorized, cataloged, better chronicled than any other pandemic in history. From scientific journals to media, etc., we will know what happened in this pandemic. Others will know what happened in this pandemic more than they've known or were able to understand what happened in any other pandemic. And the potential for this to serve as a watershed moment in the interfaith movement, I think, is very likely. Last year, during the most difficult lockdowns in the United Arab Emirates, virtually, I was in New York, but I was participating in many interfaith fora, again, digitally, virtually, and many firsts. I spoke at to the first classes of Emirati students at universities about Judaism, about our experience of the pandemic, and that was, of course, always the way in. And all kinds of opportunities opened up through virtual encounters. But it's not just that things could be virtual and therefore less threatening, but they were virtual, but they were kind of, the fuel for it was this idea that there was a shared humanity, which was now, incontrovertible. You could not deny that. Could not deny that what I did, affects other people regardless of religion, race, or creed. And that fuel, I think we're stocked up on that fuel for the next decade. This is going to be a touchstone. And in that way, the experience of the pandemic has certainly made not just those in the exclusivist camp, it's not only boosted their anti-fragility, but it has also boosted the anti-fragility of the interfaith movement. I think we also saw this expressed not only during the height of the pandemic, but some of the cycles that emerged from it. I'm thinking about the latest round of conflict between Israel and Hamas, and in many ways, depending on who you ask, it was a political conflict or it was a religious conflict, in as much as it involved the Al-Aqsa Mosque and kind of the sacredness of the location, and who it was exactly who defiled first, and who needs to restore the sanctity. And undoubtedly, both in Israel and beyond, it was a storm for interfaith activists. It actually did have some significant consequences in the United States for certain Muslim Jewish organizations who not only had to lay low, but one in particular I know even had to disband. There were friendships between clergy which were broken as a result of one person or another's Facebook post or tweet or retweet or sharing. And I think one of the things that occurred, and this is my diagnosis, and with this maybe I'll pass to Joe, is that when we are deep in a moment, when we feel like our anti-fragility is being boosted, it's difficult for us to shift into resiliency mode. That is, if I'm in the kind of confrontation where I feel with every blow that's exchanged, we're fighting this pandemic, but we as a shared humanity are fighting it together. Wouldn't this be the moment? Wouldn't this be a time where, if anything, our sense of interfaith understanding will be heightened? If we're in a moment where our anti-fragility is being boosted, sometimes it's difficult to shift when there's another kind of adversary, a war, to say, you know what, this one is not going to make me stronger. This one, I just need to be resilient. I just need to go down to a bunker. The storm is going to pass, but I just need to bunker. And that's a different modality. And so the takeaway, I would say for us, certainly for people who are being trained in the rabbinate, and the rabbinate in a way that is rooted in a common and shared humanity. One of the takeaway is that not every challenge is going to be one where when we encounter it, it boosts our anti-fragility. Some are going to be one when we just have to be resilient. We get knocked down, we will get back up again. And we should never be in resiliency mode only, because then we're not going to get stronger. We need to build our immunity. We, in a way, want something that's vaccine-like so that we can be stronger next time. That's what we want. And so I would say that the lesson for anyone engaged, certainly in the next decade, when we have this touchstone, this watershed moment of the pandemic, we need to be ready to be able to shift modes between resiliency and anti-fragility. Thank you very much.
Right, so hey Yehuda. Can you hear me? I'm just asking you, first of all. Great. Yehuda, it's great to see you, of course, and great to hear you talk. I'm one of the very few people I'd be very comfortable just listening to for hours, because there are always new insights. And of course, look, while we're on the topic of resilience, I can't start asking questions without thanking you, of course, for being here tonight, but also for providing resilience to us at ELIS in the past. And goodness, it's almost 10 years now, and in the present through your guidance in our work, but also, and I would feel slightly silly if I didn't say this, also for your friendship. That also is a great source of strength has been and still is a great source of strength also in the past year where we've spoken already. Now look, Yehuda, I'd like to just jump in with a couple of questions, because even after your fantastic input, some may still be sort of wondering about the topic of our evening, because usually, interfaith settings are directly connected to, I'd say, two very different voiceless velar plosives, namely kitsch or conflict. And now we have with the coronavirus, we have a third one. And coronavirus, you already said this, of course, doesn't care about ethnicity or gender or religion. Healthcare systems quite obviously do, but the virus doesn't. And in this context, you mentioned, you not only mentioned, but you accentuated vulnerability, interdependence, sort of modes of existence that are usually connected to states of, look, if I were to put it cynically, then to states of weakness, right? But is that maybe something looking forward also also just relying on your definition of this exclusivist approach that tries to be strong even in the face of quite obvious weakness. But is this maybe something that moving forward, these interfaith settings can actually provide a common direction based on words like vulnerability, like interdependence? Can interfaith actually be built on weakness?
Well, I think it can be. The question is, do we want it to be? Right? Do we want it to be? Many heads of state over the past year and a half have like referring to themselves as a wartime president or wartime prime minister or wartime chancellor.
Yep.
And of course, this war, unlike any other, cannot be won by any aggression, right? It can only be won by discipline, but actually education, right? Getting the right, being able to educate the public, as many people as possible, as to how they need to act. And it was a decidedly, non-macho war. I mean, it could not be won by macho man. And in fact, anybody who tried to be a macho man ended up, eating their words later on. So I don't think that it is. I think it is likely that the lexicon, the interfaith lexicon, will be rooted in vulnerability, interdependence, breathing the same air, and because the heroism that we saw, it was not the heroism of any one doctor or public health expert or nurse or cleaning person. The only time we can really describe heroism during this pandemic was the heroism of the everybody. When everybody got on board, we were able to win. So I think that's likely. But I like your term, Joe Frank. I like you're saying, well, but can we not only rely on the language of vulnerability in order to build an interfaith movement in the coming decade? Can we look to the kind of, is there a kind of power, kind of strength that we can look to, which can also be the provide the lexicon? And I think that there would be. I think that we would look to the way members in the scientific community with astounding capacity, both got it all wrong initially, but then ultimately came together and shared, across all different kinds of platforms to create a very effective set of vaccines in record amount of time. And, so can we look at that and can we draw inspiration from that and say, what is it about what enabled that global movement of scholars and researchers and practitioners to act with such lightning speed? And can that be a moment of, can that provide us with the inspiration or the language? So I don't have a good answer. I don't have it all worked out, but I like that idea. I like that direction.
But look, I think I'd like to get back to that in a second, but I think one thing that was really surprising to a lot of people, and I think that's something we can actually really learn from, is exactly what you described, right? So they got it all wrong at the beginning and then corrected themselves and then got things right and so on. But this is something that's extremely unusual, right? We're actually used to people in the public sphere and in the public forum saying, look, that one, I was sure I was right, but I was wrong, right? And now I'll try and find a new direction. I think that's something we can learn immediately. How often does one experience this, that one is convinced that one has the right answer, and then just a few moments, weeks, months later, one sees, oh, I didn't really have the right answer. But then, you try to muddle your way that your answer was somehow right, but wasn't expressed the right way. I think that's something we can really learn from the scientific community, is also just admitting to, look, that was the information I had and I was acting upon it. Since then, I've learned more and grown. And now let's move ahead.
If I could jump in though, but I would say that there still are mistakes that are being made, particularly in the way in which the scientific community, and I would say more directly, the kind of public health institutions interact with religious communities. You know, early on, there was a lot of talk about different churches or etc. being the primary avenues for spread. But think about it this way: what dialogue is there between the World Health Organization and the largest religious organizations in the world? Right? Where is that? Where is that back and forth? You know, where is that? You know, so in I see in the state of New York, you know, I was on a call recently with the governor and other Jewish leaders, some religious, some not particularly, but you know, I think New York handled that part initially pretty poorly. You know, famously, New York State issued limitations on prayer and on the number of people who could be in synagogues, etc., which was struck down by the Supreme Court. It ended up being that it was a violation, and it really nurtured tremendous antagonism between religious communities who said, "Well, we need to help us find a way. We need to pray. You know, we got to." And I understand that. You know, we need to. And public health advocates, you know, the public health establishment saying, well, we have to leave open, you know, the stores that sell alcohol, right? We have to leave open the liquor stores because we need the tax revenue, but we're going to close the synagogues. That made no sense to me, right? It made no sense to people. So, and there are still remnants of the inability of the scientific community to wrap its head around how do we create an open dialogue, the right kind of dialogue with religious leaders. And so it's not like the scientific community at this point has done tshuva, repentance for everything. Still a lot to do. Okay, sorry.
But no. I just want to jump in myself because I thought, of course, you're right on a lot of levels. I just think, again, it's also partly, I think, our responsibility, especially in this interfaith context, right? So the most visible expressions of religious communities throughout the pandemic were probably negative expressions of religious belonging, religious communities. Quite in contrast, for example, to, I mean, look, one of the great stories that you have is in this interfaith setting, actually being relevant to everyday life is your reaction to Hurricane Katrina, for example, you know? And these are sort of the things where I, now in retrospect, I think, actually, what we've been speaking about for a long time, we have to actually do this a lot more. Then we speak about the relevance of religious communities for life in society, and speak about also the good that religious communities do, that the good that comes through interfaith dialogue for things like societal cohesion, which is one of these myths that people banter around as though it existed, but it needs to be created, and it can't be created without religious communities being part of that conversation. But look, what I was thinking about there was when we talk about interfaith settings, I know that you do, and we do here as well. Also, of course, with your example, is that we both include non-religiously identified people into the way that we see interfaith worldview dialogue, right? And I really wonder about that divide as well. So while I think that there are visible expressions of religion and religious communities and religious belonging that can be absolutely positive, I think the divide between religiously identified individuals, communities, societies, and non-religiously identified individuals, societies, communities has actually gone further apart and has taken a real hit through this virus. Like, so exceptionalism is still an issue, right? Because here and it's a matter for the lawmakers, but it's also a societal issue. Like in Germany, just as an example, all religious communities had to celebrate their high holidays in isolation, right? I'm sure that it was one of the more. I mean, it's a Pesach, it's a Rosh Hashanah, it's a Yom Kippur that no one will forget, because they were all brought in. They were all in isolation. They weren't community and so on. But then in Germany comes the great exception, namely Christianity, around the corner, and says, okay, but look, we'll open up for Christmas. And then what happens later, of course, is 2 weeks later, there's an extreme spike in infections. And no one speaks about this exceptionalism anymore. So here's my question. I'm sorry, I've sort of been meandering towards a question. There are certain cases where we would like to have instances of exceptionalism, because we say our community needs the strength through communal prayer, for example. Or through even the experience of community as part of our identity. And we want that to be respected, also through in the societies that we live in. But when does that become more harmful for society at large than it can benefit our communities? Do you see where I'm getting at?
If let me just take what you're saying and just maybe a personal reflection. There is a certain kind of strength, right, that people derived by being able to either go to church or celebrate Christmas together, right? There was a certain kind of strength that people got, and the question of how you calculate. Okay, are more people being kind of nurtured or sustained or enlivened by that experience than being hurt by the ensuing infections? And my own experience in through the lockdown, and our 6 kids with us in an apartment in New York City. The city that never sleeps was under not first lockdown and then curfew. We could see no one out of our window, besides for people who literally lived on the street, and essential workers who were in gowns walking to and from the hospital. And just, and within the walls of our apartment, constant bickering, increased aggression of our family members one to another. And I know that wasn't everybody's experience. Some families got closer, but for us, that time was difficult. It was difficult. We have teenagers, we have younger kids. And still, at our Passover Seder, that was my breaking point. Okay, because during Passover Seder, leading up to the Seder, every other day, another kid or parent started developing symptoms of the coronavirus. Thank God, no hospitalizations, but with varying degrees. And then quarantining within our own apartment, we get to the Passover Seder, and my kids start arguing over whose turn it is to do the dishes. And I just lost it. I'm like, I just started shouting, like, why is everybody so ungrateful? Why are you so ungrateful? I'll do the dishes. Who cares? We're all here. Okay, granted, you have to sit 6 feet over there. You have to eat in another room. You have to wear your mask all the time. Okay, but look, I still have my job. Ima, my wife, mother, Michelle's on her job. We're here. We're not living out there in the street. We're not one of those people who's walking into a corona ward, looking like an astronaut. Like, we're here. We're basically together. Why is everybody? And this is the festival of gratitude, and we're supposed to be saying Hallel, and we're supposed to be whatever, and I just lost it. Okay, Seder was over. Okay, Seder's over. It's nice for the Seder, so you can do a do-over. We tried to do a do-over the next night, but and in that moment, I thought about, okay, really, is the fact that our family is together for this, is this a source of strength, or is this not a source of strength? what were the things that I felt that were a source of strength for me during the most difficult times. And I personally felt that I would have, had I not had been with other people during the lockdown, I would have withered. It would have been much worse for me. As much as I had outbursts like the one I described, had I not been with others, I don't know what I would have done. So, or had I been like an apartment half the size, I don't know what I would have done. I think we all would have killed each other. So I have a great deal of sympathy for those, particularly those who are older, particularly those who had, who had extenuating health circumstance before. I'm very sympathetic, to the loss of human contact, and so it's hard for me to judge that. Hard for me to judge people, particularly who are in those circumstances, especially if information that they were being fed was not true.
Look, Yehuda, before we leave the sort of the public sphere and go and talk with our students, I was glad that you also touched upon the very recent military conflict, and I wanted to just add something there, because I think there again it was an extremely trying time also here, but it was also a trying time because communities were being also sort of put into opposite camps without actually feeling that they are in opposite camps in many cases, and there was something quite I think something quite fantastic. So a friend of ours, Frederick Musal from the Heidelberg University, he started an initiative trying to get Jewish-Muslim initiatives together to come up with a joint statement of solidarity, and basically just saying, look, whatever happens, we won't let this divide us and bring the inputs that clutch all of the work that we've put into our relations in the past. We won't let that be destroyed either by the conflict itself, nor by what's being actually made out of this conflict, right? So I thought that was sort of one of these things that could actually really help us in future, are these relationships that we've been able to build and relationships that we still can build, relationships that are also very difficult relationships, because because especially in Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and that's what I'd like to ask you now, whether you can see sort of a source of resilience there. There are often extremely difficult conversations to be had, and a sense of having to actually go into conflict with each other, right? So if we talk about pluralism, what often people, especially from the political right, don't understand is what we don't mean is harmonious pluralism, right? Pluralism isn't identical with harmony. Pluralism also has inherent conflicts, arguments, dissenting views. I think the one thing that just is sort of the basis for a pluralistic view and a pluralistic approach is that we actually want these arguments to take place in order for us to actually understand each other and then to build from them. And I was just wondering there, Yehuda, whether, because you've spoken of a backlash of a different kind, right, especially with the exclusivist approaches and going back to inwards to the communities and sealing oneself off and so on and so forth. Whether you think that moving on, I mean, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, especially if we look at the global south and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But do you think that that this potential for empathetic argument, empathetic dissenting approaches, going into the painful situations with each other and not sending us alone into them, that through the experience of interdependence that we've all had, we could maybe shift into the next gear and try and focus on exactly that, focus on the difficult situations, and not try and go into the kitsch movements of, we can all break fast together and mumble something through with hummus in our mouths, right? But is that maybe the new direction to take from the experience of vulnerability and interdependence, not to go down the road of kitsch, but really to go down the road of respectful conflict? Sorry, that was a very long-winded question again.
No, it's Joe Frank, you're like, it's like whenever I speak somewhere and then afterwards the moderator says, okay, questions only, no comments, just questions. And then someone comes to the mic and says, okay, and they say blah, blah, blah. And then the moderator says, but I said no comments, only questions. He says, okay, what do you think about what I just said? That's so, but I mean, I first of all, I just want to say thank you for putting that idea out there. And if I could just respond to it. I think social media companies, AI companies, etc., as soon as everybody had to go indoors, realized something much faster than the rest of us, which is that people were going to be on their screens, and that there was an enormous opportunity for growth for everything that's online, right? And in ways that I don't think I will ever understand, and ways in which many people will not even know. But the proof is in the pudding. Look at how much money those companies made. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, and there was no additional regulation or whatever. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But it's not just about the. I'm not talking about the inequity. I'm talking about the ways in which social media has developed, even over this time. It's mostly not a good story. It's mostly not a good story. Some bright spots, some tightening of the screws around disinformation, or in the United States particularly around disinformation related to elections. But it was only after the United States experienced some of the weirdest and the weirdest and most violent moments as a result of intentional disinformation using social media as the disseminating platform. So, and they basically forced the companies, after so much egregious dereliction, to step in and to make some changes. So, okay, there are some bright spots, some very good kind of in the most positive way, copycat phenomena. There was an American actor whose name I forget, but he started producing something with his iPhone, which was called Some Good News, just to give people some good news during the event. And then, because he's famous, other people, even kids, started producing their own Some Good News. So that's great. That was great. But by and large, I think the fact that people were isolated in their homes gave an opportunity for certain kinds of radicalization, which I don't think would have accelerated in the same way. I mean, it's no secret that the way that online recruiting grows for many extremist groups is that they can make people, kind of I don't use this term in a clinical way. It's not clinical. Everyone is vulnerable to radicalization. Every human being is vulnerable to radicalization. But one of the things that occurred is that what radicalization does is it can string together the few thousand people who otherwise would never find each other, right? Who may be prone to the same radical ideas, string them together and make them feel like that they are a community. And I think we saw a lot of that. And I don't know how to reverse it. In my own family, I have to tell you that I have a family member, a very close family member, who, especially during the elections, was sending me long messages about masks, about how vaccines are going to hurt us, about the the communist liberals in the United States of America, etc. And I'm like, I didn't know like what to say even, you know.
Yep, sure. Yehuda, we'll say goodbye to this sort of public stream for now and get you to talk to our rabbinical students. But I can't let you go without just one sentence. If you think, without one question, sorry, is there any interfaith setting that you suddenly found yourself actually missing from your life in the past 18 months because it had become sort of a part of your year, of your semester or whatever, something that gave you more strength in hindsight than you actually thought it did at the time?
I think for me, the same day that my kid's school was canceled, March 2nd, I was supposed to be on a plane going to Brussels to speak at the European Parliament in an interfaith context, and decided not to get on a plane that day. I think it was also the same day that the Parliament canceled moved all events off-site. And so let me just take that as a moment in time. For me, the local interfaith engagement that I do is kind of part of my everyday normal life. But the things that have been particularly eye-opening and kind of really help nurture me and help me kind of grow and develop have been the ones where I travel to different places and meet people of different religious organizations that or persuasions that I don't normally have an opportunity to meet, and so I missed that. I missed that. I went to Dubai 4 times since last March. You know, I don't think I would have in the same way had the Abraham Accords not been signed, but and that was, I mean, there were some phenomenal experiences there. I worked on an exhibit with a local museum in Dubai, a permanent exhibition on the Holocaust, which among other stories, so the story of a family member of my wife who was saved in Berlin by a doctor named Mohammed Helmi, a Sudanese Egyptian doctor, which is now on display in Dubai. So I had that in an Arab context. I miss Europe, you know. I miss seeing you. I miss you know. So, but I hope that comes back.
Yeah, I'm sure it will, Yehuda. Yehuda, thank you very much for now. And Max, if I can get you back in and then get the rabbinical students to join us as well, that would be great.
Yes, we are going to, you can all turn your cameras and audio on now, but before we start our discussion, we're supposed to wait about 10 seconds for the lag between the live stream and now when we're here. So, you know, just, we're hello, Karen, we're seeing you, and because it's lagging behind and they're gonna cut it off. Exactly, everyone who can hear me, turn on your cameras.